Yeah, so China's unified again, right? Right? Well, yes and no. The Nanjing Decade was a time of growth, stagnation, success, failure, and bloodshed. Who could have really seen that coming? Remember Zhang Zongchang? He started a rebellion in East Shandong that would result in many dead civilians and a famine for good measure. The rebellion was supposed to get the Warlords coalition their land back in Shandong, which would go well for them, until it didn't. And Rebellion War Number 1 was over. We're not done in Shandong, however, as also in the area, the Red Spear Society was revolting over high taxes, banditry, and the general dislike of the warlord in the province. They would not get too far in reaching their goals as the warlord crushed their rebellion in 1929. Now, on the bigger scale, there were still many warlords Chiang had to get in their favor with. This led to an increasing militarism in the Kuomintang, which is always good for a stable, happy society, right? The way the KMT would hold on to the north was wooing the northern warlords onto his side, amidst lots of bickering between each other and Chiang. This would all come to a head after the Demilitarization Conference of 1929, where Yan Zhishan, Li Zongren, Zhang Faqi, and Fang Yuxiang ceased diplomatic ties with Nanjing and openly called for the resignation of Chiang Kai-shek. Did I mention Wang Jingwei had his finger in the pie as well? On Chiang's side was the Hui warlords in Gansu, which would become a vital ally in the war to come. Yes, there's going to be another war. With the first phase of the conflict over without much actual conflict, it's time for some more bloodshed. On the 11th of May, Chiang would launch an offensive onto Yan Zhishan and Fang Yuxiang's forces in the north. By way of the Longhai Railway, Chiang's forces would make their way to the outside of Kaifeng, where they would do battle with the Northwest Army. At the same time, the Central Army was getting smashed in Gansu, but the warlords were now taking a defensive posture. The largest battle of the war would take place when the Northwest Army and the Shanxi Army would attack Suzhou, with astronomical casualties sustained by both sides. The less centralized forces of the warlords would retreat, and the tide of the war would turn into Chiang's favor. Meanwhile, in the south, the Guangxi army was busy getting cut off after capturing Yuyang, which forced them to retreat back into Guangxi. Back in the north, the Shanxi army was seeing more success by capturing Jinan, and then lost it to a massive counteroffensive. The Central Army rebuilt itself in Gansu and launched an offensive against the Northwest Army. Zhang Zhuilang, coming off a hot loss against the Soviets over the railways in Manchuria, decided to end his earlier neutrality and join Chiang's side. Beijing would fall rather quickly to his armies. This failure to hold any more ground and their demoralized troops led to Yang Xishan and Fang Yuxiang resigning from their posts, putting an end to hostilities. Things were not so peachy for Chiang as the war had left his men exhausted and his government low on cash. This would come to have dire consequences in the coming offensive against certain bandits in Jiangxi. As you probably guessed by my last remark, Chiang had gotten back to his old habits of trying to eradicate the communists and suspected communists from the lands of China yet again. With some German help, he would launch the encirclement campaigns against the Jiangxi Soviet, which was set up by the communists as their home base in the fractured country. The first four would fail miserably until September 1933, when the fifth encirclement campaign was launched, with the goal of crushing the communist bandits once and for all. This endeavor was undertaken by over 1 million men, as there was no room for failure. The first phase would see gains and losses on both sides and many dead. It, however, especially did not go well for the communists, who had a hard time trying to break the KMT blockhouses, also had issues with defection and disease among the ranks. By December, the KMT forces were on the attack again, and the communists met them with the clever tactic of meeting them in open battle, outmanned and outgunned. This obviously resulted in the defeat of communist forces. So bad even that on-the-fence warlords' forces started to participate on the nationalist side. The pattern continued in the third phase, where the communists unsuccessfully counterattacked. The final phase would see further losses and a tip from Zhou Enlai's spy network, which showed that the KMT were preparing for a final push to crush the remaining communists. This would lead to the consensus to abandon the Jiangxi salient and start the Long March. The Long March would begin in October 1934, where Zhou Enlai's plan was put into action, with an attempted breakout which was destroyed, but did surprise the KMT forces. These troop movements and breakouts were meant to distract the KMT to allow more important personnel to escape. The major ragtag breakout would occur on the 16th of October 1934, with the ill-fated injured soldiers and those who opted to stay behind delaying the KMT's response until they were defeated, many being executed, one of which was Mao Zedong's brother. After the breakout, the starting force of 86,000 numbered as little as 36,000, but they would soldier on. They would realize that the nationalists under Chiang would try to intercept the communist forces if they attempted to stay in Hunan, so a push towards Guizhou was formulated. Zhou Enlai would agree with Mao. After taking Zunyi, their forces would convene to realize their defeats and set reforms to overcome them. The main argument was whether their failures were due to an overwhelming enemy superiority or military incompetence. Zhao took the latter argument, taking responsibility for his part in their defeats, and a colleague of Mao threw some shade at Bo Gu and Otto Braun, which Mao then did the same. This would result in Zhao Enlai coming out mostly unscathed, while the other two's reputations were scarred. Mao did not come out on top, but he would get higher in the rankings of the party, being elected to the Military Affairs Commission, with Zhao as his military superior. Now came time to shake off Chiang's bloody pursuit of the communist forces, heading north and attempting to bypass Chiang's main force in Sichuan. During this daring attempt at deception, Mao had a child, which was left with a family in Yunnan. All this would pay off when they would cross the Yangtze River in May 1935. Now it would be smooth sailing. They just had to navigate the perilous mountains, a lack of food, other supplies, hostile locals, and bad weather. Sounds like a piece of cake. The notable or unnotable, depending on who you believe, Battle of Luding Bridge would take place. Good news would come in the form of linking up with the 4th Red Army in June-July 1935, which numbered 84,000. A problem would arise, however, as the now superior linking force tried to influencing the smaller force. This would result in Zhao Enlai losing his position, but not much changed as Mao still wished to go northwards, and the armies split. The 2nd Red Army would have its own large march, and the armies would all meet up in Shaanxi after various fights with local warlords. So the 1st, 2nd, and the corps of the 3rd, 4th Army would meet up with local communist forces in Shanxi. Mao's forces now numbered 8,000, of which only 7,000 had made it the whole way from Jiangxi to Yan'an, out of the 100,000 who started the march. This is not the last we will hear from them, however. As all this mess had been going on, Chiang had been trying to create a better, modern China, molded to his will. He would mirror Sun Yat-sen's design of the 3 periods of governmental rule. First stage would be one of a harsh military rule to suppress warlords, centralize the government, and unify the government. Second would be political tutelage, with an autocratic government under the KMT which would prepare the people for democracy. The final stage would be a constitutionalist republic, which Chiang might forget about. The policy of political tutelage would be put forth in 1929 and would not be helped with Chiang's interest in militarism and fascism. There would be mass censorship, seeing dissidents jailed or murdered, a restriction on civil liberties, and the thought process that the citizen was subordinate to the nation. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? On the bright side, Chiang did try to improve the economic situation in China, attempting to promote industry, a growing economy, and private investment, despite lacking the resources and control to achieve these goals. Infrastructure was made, and a rejection of Western taxation was decided, which means they were always short on money. There was also rampant corruption throughout the country, and the majority share of the economy was dedicated to the army. The New Life movement would be crafted to fight the twin evils of communism and corruption, by reviving traditional values. Also, it was meant to teach the individual to be obedient to a single leader. Getting any warning signs here? It was also a big revitalization of the opium trade, which was not popular with Chiang. The Kuomintang would condemn the trade and seek to stop it. And by stop it, I mean it was encouraged by many KMT officials behind the scenes. Foreign policy was also a mess during the Nanjing Decade, fighting friend and foe alike in border skirmishes and an uneasy air with the Japanese. It would all come to a head when the Japanese would launch a false flag attack against one of the railways in Manchuria. This would lead to them blaming the Chinese for the incident, and a full-scale invasion of Manchuria would commence. Zhang Zhilang ordered his men not to engage the Japanese, and to merely escape with as many men and equipment as possible, realizing that this could interrupt into a full-scale war between the Kuomintang and Japan, which they were not ready for. The puppet state of Manchukuo would be set up with the former Qing Emperor Puyi as its figurehead. This would buy the Kuomintang time to prepare for an all-out war, which would, spoiler alert, happen 6 years later with the onset of another Japanese border incident on the Marco Polo Bridge.